So I'm not going to do any real plugs or anything right now, except to let you know that I'm at DeviantArt at BVW1979, for Affinity at BW1979, and at inkmoney.net at BW Rosas. Also, that I have affiliated stores listed as well, so you want to click on those. It helps me out. I get a little bit of kickback there. And also that the live chat is open along with Super Chat, so you want to get your thoughts in the live chat, go ahead and do so. If you want to do that as well, and at the same time donate to the channel, help me out financially, if you will. It'd be greatly appreciative. So you can do Super Chats at the same time you do a live chat, give your thoughts and everything. Also, the comment section will be open on both occasions, live video premiere and afterwards. And the Super Thanks option will be open after the video is over, just in case you don't get here in time for the for the live video premiere. Now, I wanted to come on here because, back, there we go. Just want to make sure I get this. Uh, back in October of back in October of 2023, October 21st, as you can see on the screen, Paul Dini came onto social media and he said this. He showcased this and he said this, and I quote: Paul Dini, of course, was one of the people that worked on Animaniacs and worked for the WB animation, like with Batman and Superman and all that and everything. But he basically had a resume, a run at the WBD animation with Animaniacs, Tiny Toons, Batman, Superman. I think just about any well-renowned kids WB show, Saturday morning and weekdays that you know of, he had a hand in. But basically, in October of 2023, October 21st, that is, he put this out on Twitter, on social media. And recently, as a month ago, he was communicating with fans. He's one of those writers, people that worked on shows like the shows I mentioned. That he'll interact with fans. He'll answer certain questions you might ask and everything. So yeah, basically he was one of those kind of people, and that's kind of cool to know that you can go on social media when the opportunity presents itself, and hopefully communicate with the writers and that worked on these series and try to pick their brains, see if maybe they had any other ideas or plans to do certain things with the shows, the characters, and all that as well. But anyway, like I said, back in October 21st, 2023. Paul Dini said this, and you see it online, or I see it in the video, I should say. He states that while going through some old sketchbooks and notepads from WB animation days, I found a lot of unused story pitches teaming up these two. Minerva fondly considers Slappy a grandmotherly role model. Slappy, of course, found Min deeply annoying. Retro Union at Dave Alvarez Studio, which apparently was the people. Well, not people, but it's one of the it's one of the people he worked with on the show, and he's Dave Alvarez. Looks like he's worked on Disney. He's worked at Disney a lot, as well as some other places as well. So that's kind of cool to see. It's kind of cool to see, and he also does commissions and everything. But yeah, he basically said again. This is what he said on October 21st, 2023, when he uploaded this. He said, while going through some old sketchbooks and notepads from WB animation days, I found a lot of unused story pitches teaming up these two. Minerva Mink, or Minerva, fondly considered Slappy a grandmotherly role model. Slappy, of course, found Min deeply annoying. You know, and basically what he's saying here is he had an idea, he had an unused, story pitch, because obviously being someone that wrote for the, that wrote on shows or helped write on shows, co-wrote and all that, and even artistically drew. And I had people that he worked with, like Dave Alvarez, can artistically draw the ideas. Basically, one of his unused story pitches was to team up Minerva Mink and Slappy Squirrel. Now we know Slappy Squirrel is one of the more popular characters to come out of Animaniacs, the OG Animaniacs, that is, and everything. She's one of the more popular characters. Of course, her team up with her nephew Skippy and everything, and they had some very good, prominent 8-minute to 15-minute episodes, if you will, or 15-minute shorts within the episodes and everything. So, so they were, and to me, they were very enjoyable. They were really really enjoyable. In fact, one of my favorites is basically when they go after the Siskel and Ebert parodies, the parodies of Siskel and Ebert. That I think is really funny. And then somebody recently on DeviantArt uploaded, I think it was DeviantArt, and I think on Facebook as well, uploaded screenshots of the Slappy Squirrel short, where Slappy, she's walking down the sidewalk to go get some butter or churn butter or whatever it is, right? Or milk butter, or butter, no, it's buttermilk. And what happens is she ends up tossing a can into her neighbor's recycling can or recycling tote, if you will, recycling can. And the neighbor gets annoyed by this because Slappy's just like, oh, not gonna mind. It's something she can recycle, get some money and all that, right? But the neighbor doesn't like this, and Slappy, she doesn't take being humiliated very fondly, if you know what I mean. If you know what I mean. So basically, Paul Dini's idea was to take Slappy there, that Slappy, and team her up with Minerva, who we know is a very popular character, very beloved, even with her through, even though she had two animated solo shorts due to behind-the-scenes reasonings, mostly because she was viewed as being too overly sexual and all that, and everything in her appearance, which is why, from a behind-the-scenes standpoint, her original introductory short, Meet Minerva, was delayed because of that, if you know what I mean. And that's why you see in Moon Over Minerva, like when she does her take on the lustful milk cake, where she melts into a puddle and Wilford in his werewolf form has to pick her up and wring her out. She basically is noted with her cleavage being like kind of like just one big shape. She's been noted to have the name for that Uniboob, if you know what I mean. But anyway, though, like I said, Paul Dini had an idea to team her up, with Slappy and have them be like a duo, if you will. And it's described, as he puts it here, as Minerva looking at Slappy as a grandmotherly role model, while Slappy looked at Minerva as being deeply annoying. Like basically, here's Minerva looking up to her and everything as her role model and something like that, and Slappy just being annoyed with the fact that here's this ditzy girl, basically being a nuisance, but is always hanging around with her. I guess because there might be some kind of like training or something that she's putting her through, some kind of teachings. Now you might say, well, doesn't that sound very similar to Skippy? Yeah, it does. It does sound like Skippy, basically. In a way to where essentially the idea was greenlighted, but instead of Minerva, they gave Slappy a nephew instead of Minerva as a role model, not Minerva, but instead of Slappy being a role model, grandmotherly role model to Minerva, and Minerva looking at her like that. Instead, they greenlit the idea for Slappy to have somebody look up to her as a role model, but they decided, let's make it family related, and we're going to give her a nephew who will look at her in that manner. So anyway, that was the idea, and you got to imagine how unique and crazy that might be. And in these images you're going to see coming across, I had to kind of edit them a little bit, cut them down a little bit, because I don't know how YouTube would react to some of them. So basically, this little comic, if you will, and you can find it on the AI. I think it's the AI Furry Arts Facebook group page or something. It's out there. You can find it. It's called Minerva and Slappy in Hammerspace, and essentially what this is based on the idea that Paul Dini wanted to do, and I think his name is Michael Colazin or something like that. I can't think of his name. Let me double check and everything on that, guys. Let me double check while I have my thing here. Let me see if I can pull it back up. Let me see if I can pull it back up here. Okay, the guy's name is, let me see. It is Bola Wash. Bola Wash created it, but it was uploaded by Matthew Cole. Matthew Cole and everything. And he said, and he said that he recently found out that the original plan for Minerva Mink on Animaniacs was that she was going to be mentored by Slappy Squirrel on how to be a proper tune, at least according to Paul Dini. And then they said, so here's a short example of what they might have been like, made with a combination of, certain AI materials and all that and editing. So basically, yeah. So basically, yeah, this comic that he put together as Bowler Wash, basically he's basing it on what Paul Dini said. The idea was, essentially, like I mentioned, Minerva would look at Slappy as a grandmotherly role model, but would also, I guess he got a little bit more detail from Paul, or Paul put some more detail out there. Basically, Slappy would mentor her because, again, she'd be a little annoyed with her and everything, kind of find her an annoyance, but to kind of like, I guess prevent her from being an annoyance and all that, she agrees to mentor her and everything to be a proper tune. At least, that, because they said, according to Paul Dini, that's the original idea, for Minerva Mink. To have her get mentored by Slappy to be a proper tune, be more, gag, more, very gaggy like, if you will, very like, toony and, ludicrous and all that kind of deal. So, can you imagine though? Can you imagine though, as I was trying to say, had that been greenlit? Had they been, given the okay to greenlit those two to be paired up, can you imagine the shenanigans, the stories, the animated short stories, if you will, and even the extended short stories, like the 15-minute ones, that they could have told with these characters? Can you imagine, how hilarious that would have been? Can you imagine, Slappy in one short having to, I guess let's say Minerva meets this guy she goes out with and everything, and she gets so attracted that all of a sudden, whoop, she does her lustful melt gag. Can you imagine Slappy um, going up to a Minerva melted and just scooping her up with a mop, putting her in a bucket, or kind of wringing her out in a bucket, then dumping the bucket over to restore her and everything, and then possibly telling her, "Okay, Toots, time to time to give you some pointers on what you're going to be going through and everything, and how to kind of control yourself and when's the right time to react and stuff like that." Can you imagine, that kind of a scenario? Can you can you imagine that kind of scenario? Because I could. In fact, I even asked Paul Dini back in February. I asked him online. I wonder if one of those had, because again, he had some story pitches and ideas. Story pitches and ideas for these two, right? And I asked him, I wonder if one of those story pitches had Minerva melting like in her solo cartoons and Slappy having to mop her up or something like that. And that's what I asked Paul Dini, because again, he said he had story pitches and all that for them. And again, I asked him, I wonder if one of those story pitches had Minerva melting like in her solo cartoons and Slappy having to mop her up or something like that. And Paul Dini, he did answer me. He answered me by saying, sort of. There was one where Minerva got really sick, and Slappy had to keep scooping her back into her bed because Min was desperate to keep a date with a guy she liked. So, in other words, he's stating that, in one of the story ideas that he wanted to see he wanted to hopefully see get created or greenlit, basically he's saying that yeah, she would have done the melting gag, but because she's so sick, she would have basically melted into goo, trying to basically get out of bed to keep this date, and Slappy would have to keep scooping her up like, let's get you back into bed and all that. So yeah, basically, if this idea had gone through, you would have seen Minerva doing a lot of melting, but not because of lustfulness. Well, kind of out of lustfulness, but basically because also she's sick. So basically, being that, and combined with her wanting to keep the state, you can only imagine how many melting gags we would have had in there with Minerva. But then I also asked him this question too, because I was curious. I was curious about this. I asked him, so I've always been curious. When the original Minerva cartoons came out, whose idea was it for her to basically be as silly, to basically, as silly as this sounds, do a full-on meltdown, in other words, become a puddle of goo, if you will? Whose idea was that for in the Whose idea was that for in the first one we got that aired, where Wilfred had to pick her up like a wet towel, wring her out to restore her, and then the second one where she reformed herself into a somewhat obnoxious bullhorn? Whose idea was it? Did you have say in it, or did you or did Tom have seen it? That's Tom Rugger. And I thanked him for the reply. And his reply to that was, don't know really. Sherry and I came up with her, but then I got yanked onto Batman the Animated Series. He says that Sherry, that being Sherry Stoner, wrote the first one, and the Star Tunes unit animated with Barry Caldwell and Kurt Tingleball directing. I kind of lost track of the character after that, though I eventually wrote a bunch of scripts and outlines for her that weren't used. By then, the Animaniacs series was wrapping up, and they were already had the script set. And then I thanked him again for replying, but basically, yeah, he did have ideas. He said he lost track of the character after that, after being pulled over to Batman, but then said though he eventually wrote a bunch of scripts and outlines for her that weren't used. So there was some ideas, and I didn't ask him what the ideas were or the outlines were. I mean, I'm sure he could tell us if you want. I'm sure if I ask him in the future, or anybody else ask him in the future, I'm sure we can get some ideas as to exactly what those ideas and outlines for Minerva, or those scripts and outlines for Minerva were that weren't used. I mean, again, the character to me, obviously had a lot of potential, and you see that potential get carried on into the original OG Animaniacs comics. You see it being carried on there. So you can only imagine, like I said, you can only imagine how much more fun her character would have been if she'd gotten more opportunities. And one can only assume if some of those ideas, some of those scripts and outlines that Paul had for her were basically adapted into comic book form. You can only imagine if maybe that's what happened. We'll have to see. Well, hopefully Paul might give us an idea later on. Maybe, but but to me, it's always kind of cool to hear about these kind of ideas and everything, and find out basically, what some of the original plans were for the characters. In this case being Minerva Mink and Slappy Squirrel. Now, could they have done, two separate kind of Slappy Squirrels? And my tablet just hit the mic there. I do apologize, but could they have done two individual Slappy Squirrel shorts? Slappy with Skippy and Slappy with Minerva. Yeah, I think they could have. I think in a way they could have done like one day or 1 week, or one day they could do Slappy and Minerva, and the next day Slappy and Skippy. Or they could have done 1 week of nothing but Slappy and Minerva, and then the next week nothing but Slappy and Skippy. They could have done that, and I think it would have worked. But again, one has to wonder what those other scripts and outlines were for her character, even individually, because like I said, the potential for her to do more, I think, really was there. And I think like I said, we kind of got a taste of what that potential was, or could have been, in the Animaniacs comics. Because even in one Animaniacs issue, she does do her lustful milk gag again. She does do her lustful milk gag again, but it's only when she's shopping at a mall and she goes into a jewelry store and she's getting ready to buy something, and then she sees the checkout guy who's getting ready to clock out, who's about clocked out and everything. And of course, she does her usual Minerva wild take reactions to him, and then she does her melting where it's just her neck sticking up from the puddle, and she's saying, "Woo, is it hot in here, or is it just you?" But yeah, again, I think I think if she would have been given more opportunities and everything for individual appearances in the show, I think they could have had a winner here. I think they could have had a huge winner here and everything. But unfortunately, like I said, the behind the scenes issues of her being too overly sexual, and being showcased like that in a what was dubbed at the time a children's cartoon, family cartoon, I guess was just a little too much and everything. And they felt like, yeah, this is probably not going to pass any parents' approval and everything. So they decided to not only tone her down, but just give her those two solo cartoons, and then whatever appearances she would have, like her appearance in Hercule Yakko, which was, I think, around was supposed to be around the time Meet Minerva was originally supposed to appear and all that. But basically, it limited her to that appearance, to the appearance. It was a take on the Maltese Falcon deal and all that, as well as a Star Wars parody and everything. So, and then her appearance in Wacko's Wish, she was limited to those. And they even had to, I guess you could say, acknowledge it in the 2020 in the recent Hulu reboot that they did, to where basically they had Jackal kind of acknowledge, why there was no Hello Nurse or Minerva Mink, because they had to tone it down. But we did see her. We did see her appear. Apparently, she was a victim, if you will, caught victim, if you will, of Chicken Boo, who basically, I guess, was in the disguise of a hunter who was hunting them down because he wanted the attention. But then you see her, like, her head just, on a mantle and everything, like she's been killed. But actually, she's just trapped there, and they're just, stuck in that way, like they can't really get out unless they're given the opportunity. Unless somebody comes there and frees them, like the Warners did. And basically, we see then at the end, Chicken Boo's walking off like he normally would in the original cartoon. But then you hear something in the back. But then he hears something in the background, and he turns, and he sees all these characters that were part of the OG series, including Minerva, going right after him and all that, chasing right after him because he locked them up. And that was basically the show's answer, along with what they had Jocko explain and everything when he held up the pictures of Minerva and Hello Nurse in one episode. That was also, along with that, this was the show's answer as to why they weren't in the show or why they weren't part of the show and everything. So yeah, basically, even though she didn't get a chance in the reboot and everything, it's kind of weird. It's kind of sad, if you will, that she didn't get a chance to, do more in the OG or even in the reboot. But the comics definitely were, a place where she shined. She got a lot more spotlight put on her and everything, and that was kind of cool. They even gave her, an opportunity to do parodies of Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, Xena, Warrior Princess. So that was kind of neat to see and everything. So she got a little bit more love in the comics, but it was the cartoon that basically, because of the behind the scenes issues and all that, that really just didn't do her any good. But again, you can only imagine what the scripts and outlines, what the other scripts and outlines that Paul Dini had for her were going to be like. And you can only imagine also what this team up between her and Slappy would have been like. And if this Hammer Space comic by Matthew Cole or Bolawash is any indication, you can, as well as this picture that Paul Dini used as an example, you can only imagine how great, how funny and great those animated shorts between those two would have been like. But anyway, guys, give me your thoughts in the comments if you haven't already in the live chat. How would you feel if we were able to get that, or if we were able to get that back then, if you will, in the OG series? How would you feel about that? Do you think you would have enjoyed it? The interaction between those two and everything. And also, let me know what your thoughts are on what the potential other scripts and outlines that Paul Dini had for her, had for her in mind, planned, if you will. What do you think those would have been? And do you think some of them would have involved more of her doing the melting gag and everything because of her attraction to somebody? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it and everything. If you haven't already in the live chat, you're giving your thoughts. Let me know in the comment section, if you will. But let me know how you feel about it. Would you have been interested in it and all that? And do you think maybe if they did want to redo Animaniacs again, and everything, this time maybe for, let's say, maybe for the new Paramount Max merger, if that goes through, maybe for something original for Tubi or whatever, or even for HBO Max. Do you think maybe if they were to redo it again, that having something like that, Slappy and Minerva teamed up, would be a good idea? And do you think maybe utilizing some of those other ideas that Paul Dini had, and outlines would be a good idea as well? But again, also let me know what your thoughts are on what you think those scripts and outlines from Minerva would have been, and what story ideas do you think they would have came up with outside of the one that Paul Dini kind of gave me an example of that he wanted to do. What other story ideas do you think he could have had for those two worked up? And what other ideas do you think he had worked up, I should say, for those two to take part in? Is what I'm trying to say. But let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts and everything, guys. And until next time, do myself a favor. That's like the video, ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to the channel, and share the video. And click on the links in the description to find my content elsewhere outside of YouTube, and also support me outside of YouTube as well. But give me your thoughts, guys. Again, what do you think those scripts and outlines from Minerva could have been like and everything? Do you think they would involve to doing more of the Lustful Melt? What do you think the ideas he had lined up, besides the one he gave me an example of, he had lined up for Minerva and Slappy to have together, had that been greenlit and everything? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of that down below. And do you think, again, if they were to bring back Animaniacs, maybe the revival version, and this time include all the characters, do you think teaming these two up in that, or maybe in a all new reboot of the series, or continuation of the series, and they team these two up together, do you think you'd be interested in that? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And until next time, guys, I will talk to you later. God bless. Take care.